Hey everybody, it's Tom Lynn, and I'm coming to you with another interview that I did a few years ago. This one is with Paul D'Amato of the Socialist Worker, socialistworker.org, and we talk about, I would say, principally imparting Marxian notions, or importing, if you like, Marxian notions into the American conversation, which is more generally characterized by a kind of neoliberal vocabulary that resists that approach. That's rather technical way of putting it. We become more colloquial in the conversation, but anyway, I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to WVQC 95.7 LP FM, and this is Thomas Lynn, and for the next hour or so we're making an effort at some radical analysis. I always like to remind our listeners that the word radical comes from the Latin radix for root, so we're trying to get under the surface. Before we go under the surface, though, let me quickly read this disclaimer that WVQC as a community radio station serves only to open its airwaves to responsible, divergent points of view. The opinions expressed on this program do not reflect the views of WVQC Media Bridges, its staff, or its board of trustees. The opinions expressed reflect the views of the programmer or their guests. And thank you for listening. And today we have been graced with, as a guest, Paul D'Amato, who is the managing editor of the International Socialist. Is it Social
Review?
Yes, and also has a column at socialistworker.org, among other things. And additionally, is the author of The Meaning of Marxism. So, Paul, thank you again for being on the program. So, in terms of trying to be, in accord with my introduction, I thought we might ask about the origin of profit, because the narrative around profit sort of plays centrally in instilling a belief in the general population that capitalism is a viable way of organizing society. I think one of the more powerful aspects of Marxist analysis is demonstrating that when you look more deeply into where that profit originates, it becomes more problematic. Could you maybe say some things along those lines?
Sure. I mean, am I coming across? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I think that the argument, the idea that Marx developed, which I think probably resonates with more people today as a result of their experiences with capitalism over the last couple years or so, is the idea really that the source of profit is not some kind of a reward to the capitalist for bringing together raw materials, labor, and machinery, and being benevolent enough to let people work for him, but that actually it's unpaid labor. Very much in the same way that the serf under a feudal or land-based economy had to turn over either a portion of his crop or a portion of his time working on the land to the proprietor, to the landowner. In our society, something that the market disguises. In other words, we're taught that everything is exchanged equally, all commodities. The thing that really covers up is that labor as a commodity can produce more than its own value. So Marx's great insight was that profit is derived really in the final analysis from unpaid labor. That is, we work to produce enough value, or we produce either in goods terms or money terms or in value terms, we produce more than what we get paid. And that's really where profit comes from.
Yes, and I think one of the helpful ways to sort of make that more lucid for me was when I first encountered Marx was the distinction he makes between the circulation sphere and the production sphere. And a lot of mainstream economic discussion focuses on the circulation sphere, but it's the production sphere where earned value is genuinely produced. But and so that having been said, all that's built up in Marx on the so-called labor theory of value, which wasn't originated with Marx. It had
Mm-hmm.
prior advocates with Smith and Ricardo and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Marx innovates. What was Marx's particular innovation in your reading to the labor theory of value, which distinguishes what he asserts from what is put
Mm-hmm.
forth by his predecessors?
Right. Well, the first thing to say is that, of course, Marx was very much influenced by, mainly by English political economy. And one of the things that he argues in the introduction to his very important economic work, Capital, is the idea that one of the things that the early economists could do, or what he called political economy, Adam Smith and Ricardo, is that they could talk more honestly. They could investigate the workings of this newly emerging system, capitalism, more honestly, because they were, in a sense, trying to defend the system against the order that preceded it. That is, in a certain sense, their ideas were still progressive, that they were defending the new system against the old, against feudalism, and so that they could be more open and honest about the workings of the capitalist system, and so that, and Marx makes, and that's why they were able to develop, at least in some rudimentary form, a labor theory of value. That is, labor is the source of all wealth in society. And that wage labor is about paying people less than the value of what they produce. And the thing that was, I think, what Marx then argues is that as capitalism develops, it has to then defend itself as a system against the class of wage workers. It has to find ways to convince people that this is the best of all, best, if not the only possible world. And so economists then become apologists for the system, rather than people who are trying to really discover the inner workings of the system. And on that basis, the labor theory of value has to be tossed out because it's too dangerous a theory. Because you're beginning to see the development in England, for example, in the early 1800s, of workers who take those ideas of the political economists, that labor is the source of all wealth, and use it as a basis for a new argument, which is that we need more than just a political revolution that gives us democracy, because democracy will always be unequal as long as you have rich and poor, but that we need to also have economic democracy, and that labor deserves the fruits of its own work. And that idea, of course, then of labor theory of value, becomes a too radical idea, which then has to be suppressed. And that's why you have the development of the marginal theory and ideas that really focus on the market and equal exchange and forget the realm of production and profit, and obscure it rather than explain it. But Marx's contribution, I think, was to develop the labor theory of value more systematically and draw much more far-reaching conclusions from it. For example, that capitalism is a system based upon the drive to accumulate, that is, to use that profit, that unpaid labor, to accumulate, to reinvest in competition with other capitalists, and that very dynamic of accumulation of wealth and competition within the system leads to periodic economic crisis in which the contradictions of the system come to a head, and a crisis of overproduction results, and also that leads also to a problem with the rate of profit itself, that the rate of return as capitalists spend more and more money on machinery and less on labor, that actually the very basis of profit, which is labor, can be constrained or shrunk.
Now, those are two very important propositions. Perhaps you could take the first, namely the manner in which capitalism is structurally prone to crisis. Could you maybe remark, perhaps to some level of detail, on how that conception applies to the most recent economic happenings, which seem, and maybe you could also talk about, in connection with your response, to different kinds of capital, because there's finance capital, and which plays centrally in the recent crisis, but then there's also commercial capital and industrial capital and the relationship among those terms. I know that's kind of a big question, so.
Well, I guess what I can say is that I think it's important to try to see how it is that Marx's ideas about the economy, even though obviously they were written many, many years ago, help us understand what's going on today. And one of the things that Marx says I can't remember where, is that one capitalist kills many, which is that is capitalism as a system is continually a system where the large fish, where the big capitalists gobble up the small capitalists, especially in economic crisis. The weakest businesses go under, and then they get swallowed up by the bigger ones. So there's a bigger concentration and centralization of the ownership of businesses, or what Marx called the means of production. And so, we can obviously see that today all through the 20th century, and into the 21st is really the massive growth of a global economic system dominated by handfuls of giant corporations whose revenues, whose profits, and total assets are in many cases greater than the GDPs of entire nations, and sometimes even groups of nations. Companies like Walmart, but also big, massive steel companies like ArcelorMittal and other companies, whatever, GM, Exxon. Maybe they changed their name. I don't know.
Or in the agricultural sphere too. You've got like
Archer-Daniels Midland, and right,
Monsanto.
So
that's
one.
Go on.
The second thing is that as far as crisis goes, about the current, using Marx to understand the current crisis, I think there's two things that he begins to talk about, which is the role of finance and debt, which is at the same, because the way that this crisis that we entered into in 2008 was a financial crisis and a housing bubble, which was based on massive speculation. That is, money chasing after money, and the idea that values can just be ratcheted up artificially by essentially gambling on the stock market and using, and then what they call the shadow banking system, or using these fancy investment instruments like derivatives and so on, which essentially, betting on companies to succeed or fail and that sort of thing. And what Marx said is that capitalism always looks the healthiest when it's about to crash, and that there's a kind of, in a period of growth in the system, there's a kind of, it's like a horse race. There's kind of a breakneck speed, and certain sectors of the economy tend to drive that advance or that period of growth and boom. And in this particular case, it was more, and especially in the United States, more around the question of finance and the banking system, the shadow banking system, and in particular also the housing bubble, which in effect was driving the system forward. And Marx argued that steeplechase, the horses always end up in a ditch, because the system, through debt, the debt initially becomes the means by which capitalists can continue to invest, even if they themselves don't have the capital to do it. In other words, ways to concentrate other people's money as capital to invest. But that becomes a means for capitalism to kind of develop at a breakneck speed, then becomes the overhang, which leads to the crash of the system. But the other part of that financialization is a reflection of the fact that there's been the development through the 2000s, is the development of overproduction, overcapacity on a world scale. That is, for example, the world production operates, the world's productive forces, factories, and so on, by estimates, only operate at two-thirds capacity. And if every factory was put online to produce at the pace that it could produce, you'd have another one-third of goods that in today's marketplace were unsaleable. That is, would lead to massive problems in profit rates for companies. And so one of the things that Marx also argued is that crisis in capitalism is not just a financial issue, but a crisis of overproduction. It's the first society where there could be an economic crisis because there are too many cars, too much steel, too much grain produced. Not, of course, in terms of what ordinary people need in their lives, as far as housing and food and shelter and transportation go, but in terms of what can be sold profitably, which is why you can have a system where there is an abundance of grain, but 6 million children dying every year from hunger-related diseases. And you can have an abundance of materials that could be used to build houses, and yet in every city several tens of thousands of people who don't even have a place to live. And of course all those things are exacerbated by economic crisis. Those kinds of the abundance on one side and the lack of means of subsistence on the other.
And yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, and actually, it also connects, does it not, with his other thesis about the ever diminishing rate of profit for capitalism as a whole, in that
Right.
there's a need to rely on things like financialization to conceal the manner in which the there is no, or there are fewer and fewer places where you can effectively exploit the workforce in a fashion to yield profit. And
Right.
so they actually hang together there. But some people will challenge the latter thesis that that the rate of profit will inevitably fall, and because the way Marx framed the matter was that it has to do with technology, and the increasing reliance on technology diminishes our capacity to actually access labor as the only real source of value. So could you maybe talk about those the counter position that, well, that sounds really nice, and it makes sense that Marx would make that supposition in the middle of the 19th century when
Right.
industrialism was on the rise, but here we are 150 200 years later, and not really quite that long, and
Right.
so could you talk about that controversy, actually, even within the
Sure.
Marxist tradition at large?
Yeah, there is debate over that question, over the question of the falling rate of profit. I think that the first thing to understand is that for Marx, he called it the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And in Volume 3 of Capital, he talks about that tendency having what he calls countervailing factors of tendency, so that it isn't just sort of, the more capital spends on machinery, the less there is a labor component, that automatically leads to a falling rate of profit. He argues that that's a tendency in the system, but that there can be countervailing factors, and there are several. One of which is obviously driving down wages as much as possible, and that's one of the ways, of course, we've been experiencing, which is one of the ways that capitalists get out of the crisis of overproduction and profitability, is to drive down wages as far as they can, and labor costs, which raises the rate of exploitation, that is how much they're squeezing out of each worker in terms of wealth. And of course, all the statistics show that over the last couple of years, productivity has increased dramatically, while wages have stagnated or declined. And of course, they've been using the high levels of unemployment to achieve that, and that's a common feature of every crisis. And one of the biggest other countervailing factors to the falling rate of profit related to the question of economic crisis is how, in an economic crisis, lots of businesses go under. And what Marx argued is that one of the things that happens when lots of businesses go under is that other capitalists that didn't go under are able to buy their businesses and their means of production, their factories, and so on the cheap. And it means that actually that immediately lowers the costs, the operating costs, than they were before the crisis, which means that when there's a recovery, these capitalists can more quickly recover their rates of profit, so that there's not a direct relationship between how much is spent on machinery, how much technical or physically of kind of growth of technology and machinery there is compared to labor, but also its value or its cost relative to labor as well. That's another way that profit rates can be restored. And then, of course, there's lots of other ways, heightened levels of exploitation by using cheaper labor, going overseas to find cheaper labor. There's lots of ways. And the other, of course, is the cheapening of the costs of the means of production, the costs of machinery and technology, by developments in the labor costs of that technology itself. That is, the invention of computers, robotization, and so on. It does reduce the labor can reduce the labor component in production, but it also reduces the cost of the means of production as well, and that can also affect the rate of profit. And so I think that what Marx was trying to say is that the falling rate of profit is itself, over the long term, is an indication of a central contradiction at the heart of the system that in and of itself is not going to lead to the breakdown and collapse of capitalism. For that, ordinary people, wage workers, what Marx called the proletariat, we don't use that term anymore, but people who work for a wage and are exploited in the system ultimately have to have some kind of a collective response to challenge the system economically and politically and fight for economic and political democracy. The system itself points the way to an alternative because it's such an abundant system, yet it can't feed its own slaves. But the slaves themselves, the majority, people who are exploited by the system, have to kind of come together and make something of that. It doesn't just happen by itself. Capitalism doesn't just fall apart.
Now, what about? I mean, what about the relationship between the government and the capitalist class? Because I think that sort of enters into it
Yeah.
as well. Because that's one way in which corporations, for example, can save their profit margins is vis-a-vis open and hidden subsidization.
Sure. And I think that what we're learning about government under both, the last two administrations really makes that clear. I mean, I don't think there's very many people who would doubt that the Bush administration was very beholden to, I don't know, they called it the oil and gas administration. That it was very much beholden to oil and gas interests. I think it was Frederick Engels who once said, America is the place where democracy consists of two great gangs of speculators, the Republican and Democratic Party fighting over the spoils of office and really serving the interests of big business. And I think that that's not a difficult argument or case to be made today on that score. If you look at anything from the Gulf oil spill, the fact that just before the spill, the Obama administration, which had said it was going to kind of curtail offshore oil drilling, suddenly flipped and changed its mind. Then the BP oil spill happens, and you find out that the Minerals Management Administration, that is supposed to be regulating this industry, in fact, is staffed with people who were former people who were part of the oil industry and who were really being plied with, wine, women, and song in order to basically promote the interests of big business rather than regulate it. And of course, that kind of history is goes throughout the economy. The latest thing I'm reading, a new book that Haymarket Books is going to be publishing, is about how the whole first part of the book is about how the history around questions of tobacco, asbestos, poisoning the environment in various ways, how companies have been very adept at spending their millions and billions of dollars on public relations firms and on lobbying and on making sure that their people come in and out between industry and government, that they're able to kind of organize whole kind of political campaigns to try to sow doubt in, for example, does asbestos cause asbestosis or mesothelioma, to cast doubt on the idea, which they did for years, that cigarette smoking causes cancer, to cast doubt on the idea that global warming is caused by the development of human caused things is
right.
Is valid and so on. So there's I think you can say that what President Truman once said. I think it was Truman who said, if you go to your government, they'll listen to you politely, but the people they really listen to are the bankers and the industrialists. And I think that, if you look at the bailout today, if you look at how both administrations have really operated, that is so obvious. I think it's almost impossible to deny.
And I mean, let me ask you. I mean, I don't want to get weighed down in just pessimistic speculation, but one thing that I think is quite challenging is the reception of the Obama administration, because there was so much promise held by significant segments of the left that he was going to, he wasn't going to be genuinely radical, but that he was going to precipitate a kind of FDR-like shift. But it seems that, when you look at his appointments, his policies, etc., he's not only failed to do that, he's, I would argue, actually substantially betrayed the message which he put forward. I mean, you could say, well, if you look at the fine print, he was consistent, but nevertheless, the tone. Well, the question is that despite, from where I stand, the obviousness of his transgressions, there's still an incredible sympathy on the left. There's a residual apologetic for Obama. Oh, he's only been here for so long, or oh, this or oh, that. And I mean, why isn't the left being more vocal? I mean, there are segments within the left. It's not homogenous, but why are they not resisting more vocally what he has done in his administration? Or, I mean, if you
Well,
want to challenge
right.
the premise of my question, you can do that as well.
No. I think that I agree that there was tremendous hope, and I think that it was. I'm not saying that the Obama's message was more substantial, but the response to it had more substance than I think what had happened in the recent history with the Democratic Party. And there was, I think, some sense among lots of people. There was a sense of excitement that something could be different. And if people recall, Obama's own speeches during his campaign, he would quote Rosa Parks, and he would say things like, he would make references to Frederick Douglass. And he even made a speech where he said, without struggle, there is no progress. He would make speeches saying things like, it's up to you to make a difference. Change doesn't come from the White House. It comes to the White House. As you would say things like the Civil Rights Movement taught us that, you have to fight for things. You can't just elect the right people. I mean, he literally said things like that. And so there was this sense of real hope around the election that I completely agree was really rhetorical, and that Obama really was much more of a mainstream Democrat who had his pulse on the had his pulse on the wrist of America, and actually read the thing. The thing that I think that's exciting about that is not the Obama administration itself, but the fact that that kind of a message really, I think, indicated to me and that there was the potential for a radicalization to the left in society against all the injustices and economic inequities in the system. And that's one of the reasons why Obama was successful. I mean, he was accused of being a socialist during the election. That's not a recent thing. I mean, he was being accused of wanting to spread the wealth around, and that was some horrifying thing that people had to oppose. And I think, in fact, that right-wing propaganda was one of the things that helped Obama get elected. People said, and so I think now that there are a lot of people who are saying, well, geez, if spreading the wealth around is socialism, I want to find out about what it is. And that's what I think we're finding, is that a lot of young people, especially people who are unhappy with the way the Obama administration has behaved, are looking for an alternative. So I think on one level it's true. There are liberal organizations and some left-leaning organizations that are basically saying, give Obama a chance, and especially with the rise of conservatism again and the resurrection of the Republican Party, around these sort of movements around Islamophobia and government spending and the bailouts and so on, that there's people who think, well, we have to hew closer to the Democrats because we don't want the right to win. But of course, there's, I think, an argument to that which is extremely important that we on the left need to make, which is, in fact, the Democratic Party has contributed to allowing the right wing and the Republican Party to claw its way back by its behavior. That is, by the triangulation that they brought back from the Clinton era, by the sort of policy of appeasement towards the right wing. The most obvious one, obvious is the behavior of Obama, where he'll make an initial criticism of something that sounds progressive and then backtrack a day later. That happened with the cop who harassed and arrested the black Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates. Obama criticized it, said it was a stupid act, and then backtracked and invited the cop and Henry Louis Gates for a beer in the White House, where the cop refused to apologize. It's also when around the mosque, the Islamic Center controversy in New York City, and it became a national issue, where Obama's initial statement was, we're for religious freedom, and this is a problem. And then when they asked him to clarify his point, he said, but I'm not saying that I support the thing, because there has to be discretion, blah blah blah. So the Obama administration, on questions of homeland security, on the questions of torture, on rendition, on the closing of Guantanamo Bay, on passing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, on immigration reform that creates a path to citizenship, on any number of questions, the Obama administration has been largely rhetorical and hasn't actually, and in some cases even really tried to prove that they're just as effective as the quote right wing of the Republican Party. I just read the Republicans leaked a memo which they claimed said that the Department of Homeland Security was going to create a backdoor policy that was more lenient on undocumented immigrants. And the response of the Department of Homeland Security was, that is an out-and-out lie. We've arrested and deported and detained more people than the Bush administration, and we're proud of that record. Of course, with that kind of rhetoric, clearly, the right wing has a field day with that, because it doesn't do anything to challenge the right. If anything, it creates a space for them to get a better foothold. So I think, though, within that context, there are people, in addition to people who think we have to hew closer to the Democrats to prevent the right wing to get into power, which is a mistaken policy, there are people, like you said, who are disillusioned with the Obama administration, who wanted real change, and who actually their radicalization will be deepened, and their sense of that we need a real alternative to the two-party system will become more pronounced. And I think that audience is also growing in the United States, and that's going to be the basis upon which a new left can be built in this country.
And in terms of courses for a newer left to follow, I mean, what would be some of the chief courses of action recommended, say from a Marxist standpoint?
I think that we have to keep real close attention to any manifestation of resistance and try to find people who want to resist different aspects or problems with the system, whether it's against cutbacks, school closings, privatization, I think, against evictions. But there are various ways in which we can really begin to try to knit together people who want to resist aspects of the crisis and this attempt to impose the cost of the crisis on our backs, both in workplaces but also publicly through, pushing the debt, the private debt that's really the banks are responsible onto the public, and then using that as an excuse to implement austerity measures. And then we have to look for points of resistance and see what ways that we can organize around that. The second thing I think that's going to be important is really just looking for people who are looking for an alternative to who are looking, there's an ideological opening, in other words, that there's a lot more people who are anti-capitalist. I mean, let's put it that way. There's been several polls, including a Rasmussen poll about, several months ago, which said that 47% of people don't think capitalism is better than socialism. And that within that, about 30% of young people, below the age of 30, think that socialism is better than capitalism. So, however vaguely that's defined, because, of course, in our country, no one really talks about in a clear way about what socialism is. It's mostly driven by the right wing, the discourse. But I still think that what that means, what those polls show, is that people are dissatisfied, and especially young people, young working class people and students are dissatisfied with the society that they're living under in many respects, are more liberal and more progressive than their parents around questions of immigration, gay rights, racism, and things like that, and have more of an economic sense that their lives aren't going to get better than their parents, and that they have nothing to lose by trying to search for an alternative. And we're finding that. We're meeting people like that, the organization that I'm in, the International Socialist Organization. And I think that we want to try to relate and find and talk to people like that. The other thing that I think is important is that in order to build a broader left, but also to show people that there is a way to confront the right, rather than appease the right, that we actually have to organize opposition, especially when the right wing hits the street. So, for example, this Quran burning stuff. I think that, in places like Florida, where there was an attempt at the Quran burning, in New York City, where there's going to be the demonstration, conservative Islamophobic demonstration at Ground Zero, but there was also a counter-protest. I think that those things are really important. I think counter-protest, confronting the right, pushing the envelope, that's going to be a way in which I think to transform the political climate and prove to other people who are still radicalizing within this political climate that there is an alternative, and that alternative is not just ideological, but you can do something about it. You can help be part of a movement that shifts the political climate and pushes things leftward and in a more progressive direction. And really, I think it all comes down to the question of the crisis. In an economic crisis, there's scapegoating, and that can create an opening for the right. But there's also the sense an economic crisis can develop a greater sense of class consciousness and the idea of solidarity, and that an injury to one is an injury to all. And that's what the left has to take advantage of as a way of building the left on a more solid footing among ordinary people in the United States.
Now, in terms of, I'm don't. I agree with pretty much everything you said, but I was just going to ask, on that last point of class consciousness, I think that's kind of really challenging because you can get people to crystallize around like points of resistance, whether that be evictions or what have you. But I am simply not. I don't personally experience a working class consciousness in America. I don't really encounter that. I know it's been there historically, and there are remnants of it, but people seem more caught up in the notion of a middle class, and I wonder if the conception of the middle class effectively hypnotizes people in a way which strongly undermines their relation to a more radical narrative. So. What are your thoughts in that? Where do you see working class consciousness? How do you understand the narrative of the middle class? Could you elaborate on those points?
Okay, well, first on the question of that idea of America being a predominantly middle class society, I agree. I think that's one of the major ways, it's one of the major components of what Marx called the ruling ideas of society. Which he says, everywhere, the ideas of the ruling class, which are disseminated deliberately, which attempts to divide the oppressed and exploited. And the idea that we're all middle class is one of them, that anyone can make it. You should try to be your own boss. That's the way you escape your own, a crappy job. It's not by uniting with other workers or seeing yourself as in solidarity with other people against the employers, but that and that essentially America is a society where, you're absolutely right, where, well-paid, skilled workers are encouraged to think of themselves as part of the middle class. The UAW, if you're in the UAW, you're part of the middle class. You're a hardworking American who's part of the middle class. That's definitely an ideology that's meant to try to obscure the real heart of, the economic system, which is really class division and, exploitation. I think that that's historically always had an impact, but that the impact of those ideas, of course, those ruling ideas, weaken because of the economic crisis, and of course will ultimately weaken much further when there's a redevelopment of class struggle. In the United States, I think that class consciousness is rudimentary. It's kind of rudimentary, and it's a very mixed consciousness, and in the sense that people partially accept the stuff that's pounded into our heads every day in the news media and with the right-wing noise machine and so on, and half reject some of those things based on their own experience. And it's that mosaic and competing ideas when people's own experience are challenged by those ruling ideas, that creates an ideological opening to which then an opening is even further created by issues by the class struggle itself. So, for example, there's nothing more bracing to an argument about, why are the banks being bailed out and not working class people than, for example, the Republic Windows and Doors occupation in Chicago, where the company secretly closed down, left the workers high and dry, and the Bank of America wouldn't extend the loan, a very small loan that was necessary to keep the company running, and the workers occupied the factory, and that's shown a spotlight on the company, but also on Bank of America, and forced them to cough up the money. I think that the combination of the ideological opening created by the crisis of capitalism with what I think will be, in the future at some point that can't be predicted, the growth of class struggle in various forms is going to really be the basis on which a new class consciousness develops in the United States. Obviously the left has a part in trying to develop that through participation and leadership in various local struggles. in which, we confront those ideas both in people's practice and in their ideas, and try to convince people that it's class solidarity that's the basis of changing society. I think also that it's really difficult to tell people that there's an American dream based on building your own business when small businesses are failing, that people can't find jobs, that people are going for months at a time without work, when students are graduating from colleges and can't get jobs not only in their own field but in any field. And the idea of a kind of American dream and we're all middle class, certainly those ideas don't die automatically, but the environment exists in which they can be more easily challenged.
So there is actually this is a time of great opportunity for the left.
Yes.
Precisely because climate is such where the structure of the system can no longer, the many of the common lies really cannot be sustained plausibly. So, but it's a time that you have to take advantage of it, because even as we speak, you have interests like the Tea Party taking advantage of the same crisis and the same emotion to frame it matter in a very different way.
That's
So,
right. That's right.
And I mean, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, if you want to see an example of that, just look to Europe. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
If you look to Europe, where you have the xenophobia that's being pushed by a rising hard right. So you have Sarkozy in France, in response to a kind of growth of anti-immigration politics, attacking the Roma, deporting Roma, which is just so ominous and frightening. In Italy, attacks on immigrants, physical attacks on immigrants. The growth of the Northern Leagues, the far-right organizations in Northern Italy. In Norway, the decline of social democracy and the rise of, for the first time in parliament, of far-right parties. Things like that, which obviously shows that it's not just in a period of economic crisis the right can grow, but especially when what tried to pass itself off as some kind of a progressive or left alternative has itself been part of pushing through neoliberal policies that have hurt the working class. So that, in a lot of European countries, so social democracy has been part of the political, wallpaper. It's been part of, it's actually carried through austerity measures in Europe against the working class. And so, they've actually helped open the door to that growth on the right. So in a period of economic crisis, both the left and the right can grow, but there's an urgency to rebuild the left, and that has to be both political and ideological in terms of rebuilding, really putting out their socialist ideas in a way that's accessible to people, but also providing an alternative that combines ideas with action, that combines a real alternative to people, so that those false alternatives, the socialism of fools, as Engels once called anti-Semitism, which is basically an appeal to hatred of the rich and fear of being hurled down into the impoverished. The use of scapegoating against immigrants, against people of other races, and so on. So that's why I said fighting the right and finding those people who are already ready or are moving in the direction of searching for a political alternative on the left has to be combined.
Now, it seems to me that another piece of the puzzle has to do with the current wars, and really all over the world, but most notably lately in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. It seems that a lot of, in America, rhetoric around war, despite the fact that the wars are grievously unpopular, you still see over the past 2 or 3 years the military has been successful in recruiting significant numbers precisely because of the economic crisis.
Right.
But by participating in that complex, the military complex, you're actually, I would say, feeding into the very system which is creating the grounds of your own oppression. Does there not need to be more stalwart or resistance to the notion of the wars themselves, but also to participation in the very system which propagates those wars?
Yes, I think so, but I also think it's really important not to organize it on a moral basis. In other words, on the idea that an appeal to a soldier that they're contributing to American imperialism and that therefore they're somehow bad. I think there has to be because you're not going to have a conversation that lasts very long on that basis. I think it's important to rebuild the anti-war movements, which I think were more developed, some few years ago, and I think that's going to be resisting American empire. I think is an important component. There are some difficulties that we face, which is that the number of, first of all, because it's an all-volunteer army, even though like you said, there is an economic draft. That is different from people being forced by law to join the army. And go to war like it was in Vietnam. And also the numbers of people that are caught up in the military and are directly involved in war is far smaller than it was during the Vietnam War. But I think that the dragging out of, I think really the question of war has to be connected with the economic crisis, the position of the American empire in the world, the threats that it considers to its own power and prestige abroad, related to the rise of China and India and other countries, the relative shift in the weight of economic power in the world that the United States, worries about and tries to compensate for with military power. But then, of course, at some point, the economic power has to match the military. Otherwise, it becomes an economic drain that can't be sustained over the long term. So I think that while it's not clear to me at this point how and when, at what point we'll have a more developed anti-war movement, I think it's intimately connected to, over the long term, with the fate of American empire and its relationship to the strength or weaknesses of the American economy in the world system, and therefore the questions of spending at home versus spending on social programs, the question of spending on war versus providing jobs, all those sorts of things, I think, are going to make the question of war much more closely linked, even more than it was during the Vietnam era, because then it was a period of guns and butter. It'll be much. The questions of economy, of economics, and of crisis will be much more closely linked in people's minds with the question of war, and that's also something that we have to, in our propaganda and in our political work as a left and progressive community, we'll have to pay attention to.
I mean, could I also ask you? It's very closely related, but somewhat broader than how do you engage the question of how people identify as an American, or really, the question of nationalism or patriotism or whatever term, because it seems that ultimately effective resistance has to be related with a kind of global consciousness, and in a real way, I think a nationalist or patriotic, they're not identical, but they're similar narratives, undercut movement toward that global consciousness. I mean, how do you engage that issue? What do you say?
I think that there's different ways it can be addressed. I think that ultimately it comes down to combining. There's two issues. One is the question of international class solidarity. That is the idea, as workers struggle, that, for example, if you're an auto worker in Detroit or in Tennessee, your interests aren't any different from workers that are exploited by the same country in another country, by the same company in another country. So that one of the results of globalization potentially is the creation of a global class consciousness between workers. And I think that has to be explored more. And I think as labor movements develop in different countries, those connections will be made in a more extended way. I think in Europe there are going to be meetings between labor movements in different countries and the left in different countries to figure out how to resist the austerity that's being pushed through in Europe, and that's a good sign. I also think that in the United States in particular, since in terms of imperialism, in terms of the biggest, most powerful countries dominating the weaker countries, that's most prominent in the United States. the question of international solidarity has to be combined with really, social movements that challenge the idea that America has the right to police and dominate the world. Because I think in a lot of ways that's pushed, people are encouraged almost unconsciously to think that it's okay for the United States to have its troops everywhere. That somehow the United States is uniquely positioned to help, in quotes, the world, and that's part of the ideology which ties the American people to a conception that they have the same interests as their rulers or as their employers and so on. We're all Americans, and America is a uniquely positioned country because of its democracy and its pluralism, that it can spread democracy around the world and stop nasty things from happening. And I think that that's an ideological and social struggle that we're going to have to really engage in order to convince people that their interest lies in a rejection of American patriotism and its replacement with the idea of international solidarity between the oppressed and exploited. I mean, that means people have to be convinced of the idea that Puerto Rican people, if they so choose, have the right to be independent. That Native Americans in the United States have a right, if they so choose, to have their own land back. For treaties to be honored that gave them much larger chunks of land. That people in the people in the Middle East have a right to be left alone by, and to determine their own fate. I think that those, and I think we could go back to, I think we can point to the experiences that we've had already in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also go back to the American Revolution itself to say, well, we're the Redcoats, and do we really want to be the Redcoats, or do we want to be with the people who are resisting the Redcoats?
I mean that sort of really points at it, the heart of it, because that's how we frame it, so that the population is sort of, the rhetoric is not that we're the redcoats, but that we're the emancipators. But that indicates exactly that the dominant elite is actually acutely aware of these issues and works actively to diminish awareness in that regard. But we're coming up here. I want to give you the opportunity, if there's anything that you'd like to discuss or bring forth that I haven't specifically given you the opportunity to bring up or discuss. Is there any issue that you'd like to address?
Maybe I could finish by reading a quote from Eugene Debs about what socialism is.
Sure.
How about that?
That sounds fantastic.
Eugene Debs was an American socialist who, it's pretty. I think it is a pretty common argument to say that socialism is a foreign import, that it's never had any resonance in America. And of course, the thing that I always cite to people when they say that is that Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned for making a speech against U.S. involvement in World War I, saying the only war that I'll fight in is the class war. Made a speech in Canton, Ohio in 1918 and was put in prison for several years for speaking out against the war. He ran for president from prison on the Socialist Party ticket and won almost 1 million votes as a prisoner with the United States government. So that gives you some idea that socialism has not always been an American idea. But I just want to quote him from one of his articles about what is socialism. The earth for all the people, that is the demand. The machinery of production and distribution for all the people, that is the demand. The collective ownership and control of industry and its democratic management in the interest of all the people, that is the demand. The elimination of rent, interest and profit, and the production of wealth to satisfy the wants of all the people, that is the demand. The end of class rule, of master and slave, of ignorance and vice, of poverty and shame, of cruelty and crime, that is the demand.
And that those are all quite resolutely just demands, and ironically demands, I think, that virtually anyone would assent. That's the kind of sort of comedy of the situation. So, but Paul, thank you so much for being on the show. So,
sure. And let me also just say though that if anybody wants to talk to me more about this discussion has any questions, you can reach me at pdamato@isreview.org. PDAMATO at isreview.org.
Well, thanks you. Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again. And
All right.
and do have a lovely day. I'll let you go. So
Thanks a lot.
thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So there you go. That's Mr. Paul. He might be doctor. I don't know if he's got his PhD or not. D'Amato, of the ISR and socialist worker, and author of The Meaning of Marxism. And thanks again, Paul, for a great interview. I don't really have anything else to add at this time, but let me just go ahead and close with a reiteration of the disclaimer. WVQC as a community radio station serves only to open its airwaves to responsible divergent points of view. The opinions expressed on this program do not reflect the views of WVQC, Media Burgess' staff, or its board of trustees. The opinions expressed reflect the views of the programmer or their guests, and thank you for listening.